Rich Scrivani for Front Row. Now, last time you'll remember the authors of Universal Horrors, John and Michael BRUNAS and Tom Weaver, were telling us about the classic horror films of the Golden Age, the 1930s. Now, Universal was not the only Hollywood studio venturing into horror at that time, but I think it's safe to say that they contributed the most to horror movie lore back then. So let's rejoin the BRUNASes and Tom Weaver for the conclusion of our discussion. Come with me to the front row. We're continuing our discussions with the authors of Universal Horrors, John and Michael BRUNAS, Tom Weaver. We didn't get to the Black Cat, did we? We mentioned Edgar Ulmer, or I think we mentioned him, but if we didn't, he was he was probably the second most artistic director of the Universal output in that era, right? Am I correct?
Yeah, I would think so.
Now, if you read the original shooting script, or what was supposed to be in that film, they had some pretty heavy stuff. For those of you who don't know the film, it involves satanic black masses, and Boris Karloff is the leader of a group of devil worshippers, and Bela Lugosi is mixed up in all this. I don't know how much we should talk about the plot, because I think everybody's seen it. But they were going to do some stuff at the end of that movie that was absolutely, I don't know how they could have gotten away with it, or how they thought they could have filmed something like that at that time. How do you suppose they even dreamed of filming the more gruesome aspects of that movie?
No, I think a lot of the Universal scripts a lot of scripts of that era have more gruesome touches in the original scripts than made it to the screen. Either the censor's office stepped in and kiboshed it, or they just self-censored themselves when it came time to shoot these things. I would love
Those scenes were shot, though.
Yeah, I would love to see what was shot for the Black Cat. There are a lot of, for all the film restoration that's going on, not too much has been done with some of the most famous films of the 30s, the Universal horror movies. There are still a lot of lost scenes that I think people would love to see.
Like the Bride of Frankenstein footage?
The extra Bride of Frankenstein footage, extra footage from The Mummy of different reincarnations of Zita Johann.
There's a whole scene from The Wolfman that's missing. The problem is, where did this footage go? And if any of this stuff survives, it's almost a miracle, considering the studio policy at the time of just destroying most of the outtakes. I mean, if anything survives, it's just a stroke of luck.
What is the scene from The Wolfman that's missing? I can't offhand bring it to mind.
There was a scene when Lon Chaney Jr., who plays the Wolfman, he's at a gypsy carnival, and he has a wrestling match with a bear, and I think it was probably cut because probably the scene didn't work.
Yeah.
But
there's a little bit of it left in the trailer.
Right. I was going to mention that after he's done, he looks like he's standing over the bear for a second.
Yeah, I thought it was excessively gruesome.
Yeah. I think there are a lot of reasons why these scenes are cut, is because they didn't work. I mean, my own private theory is that a lot of these films maybe just were cut because they didn't help the film either.
Mm-hmm. So you think that footage, specifically the footages of the climactic scene in The Black Cat, where Boris Karloff is skinned alive by Bela Lugosi, they were showing all this. They were maybe in shadow, but they were much more explicit with what was going on. And you don't think that was filmed, or you do think it was shot?
No, it was definitely filmed, according to reports that we looked up.
Yeah, there was a great article in the American Cinematographer about the making of that movie. The director's wife, Shirley Ulmer, doesn't remember shooting those scenes, but there's an American Cinematographer article that certainly makes it sound, where the guy certainly came up with paperwork that indicated that they were.
Well, it's going back to the missing footage from The Mummy. I know it involved reincarnation scenes of Zita Johann, who was playing Ankh-Senamen, And now, where exactly would that have appeared in the film, as we know it today? Where was that supposed to be? I'm a little
Towards
unclear.
3/4 of the way through the film, when Zidi Alhan's character is becoming more and more falling under the power of the mummy, Artif Bey, and what clinches the whole thing is he takes her back into time via a pool, swirling vapors of like the pool of time or whatever.
Yeah.
She gets to see herself as various famous characters like Joan of Arc being burned at the stake, or she's in the, I think she's in the Roman Colosseum. She's
a Christian
being mauled by a lion.
Yeah.
And then it brings her up to date. There was
Renaissance, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that went on for a few minutes, and that was all cut. I think it just stopped the thrust of the plot dead in its tracks, probably. Although I could think of other scenes they could have cut to make room for that.
It's probably a shame because think of all the effort that
Well,
went
they
into
spent a lot of
making
money
it.
on those scenes.
Historical stuff. We see stills of it. You know.
Yeah,
It'd be nice to see the cut footage. Now, one I wanted to get to, Werewolf of London, right behind you there. That has always been considered sort of a black sheep entry of the 30s because, well, let you guys tell me why that is. Because I've always held it up as one of my favorites, and yet it's kind of discussed in less than favorite terms.
In the first place, it isn't really as good as the best of the other the films that went before it. I had a sort of a second-rate director named Stuart Walker in charge. It didn't have any of the more famous horror stars in it, although the film could have very easily been a vehicle for Karloff and Lugosi. Instead, they got Henry Hull and Warner Olin. Warner Olin, who's the famous Charlie Chan actor, who weren't exactly the personification of screen terror, you know. So the film was a good film. I'm not sure if it was a great one. And if it's a poor relation, maybe it probably deserves it, although it's not a bad film.
Well, why did they not get Karloff and or Lugosi for that? Was there a reason for that? They were under contract.
Not that I recall ever uncovering. Actually, the movie is one of my favorites because they're not in it. It gives it a nice air of novelty to have two other guys for a change.
Well, there was some talk in the early 30s of turning Henry Hull into a horror actor, but Hull claimed in later interviews that he wasn't real interested in being associated with the genre. Well, he did Tobacco Road on Broadway to great acclaim, and he probably saw no reason to be associated with the horror films exclusively, because once you're typecast, that's the kiss of death.
Yeah, it was in the late 30s actually that MGM wanted, and Todd Browning wanted to make him a horror star, and he did Miracles for Sale, and then that was it.
You know, it was different for Karloff because he didn't have much of a career before Frankenstein. He was a fairly busy character actor.
Yeah.
So if he became associated with, you know, it just assured him of many decades of employment later on.
Yeah. I happen to like, one of the things I happen to like about Werewolf of London is maybe one of the things that some people don't like is the sequence with the two old ladies. Their names escape me.
Mrs. Wack and Mrs. Munchausen.
Right. The actors' names escape me.
Oh, Ethel Griffiths and
Ziffy Tilbury.
Tilbury, right. To me, that always reminded me of a little bit of, I would have almost guessed James Whale might have done that because...
I think they were attempting to capture that Walesian humor.
Yeah, maybe it was a little too much. I don't know.
I don't think people hold that against the film as much as, it's rather, I mean, I like the film as much as everyone else here does. It's rather stagey and slow and episodic.
Yeah.
And Henry Hull isn't the most sympathetic character either.
He goes
that's
in,
true.
you hate him going into it almost because he's so nasty to his wife.
Yeah, exactly. And when he turns into a werewolf, okay, that's your problem, buddy. You know.
Oh, I feel sorry for him by the end.
By the end, yeah, but
You know,
not
he's
for a
lying there
long.
on the floor. And
Yeah, in the last 40
I'm
seconds.
crying
Yeah.
along with Valerie Hobson.
Would you have given him CPR if you were there? So, do you feel that bad for him? Here's some of the, we were talking before the show started about some of the alternate titles they were going to come up with for Werewolf of London. These are really worth reading. Moon Doom, The Relief of Death, What Price Curiosity, The Whelp from Tibet.
Now,
What's
this
a
is
whelp?
actually a contest for publicity purposes that the studio drummed up, asking people to submit ideas for titles.
Oh,
I
okay.
think it was people from within Universal.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but there could have been people, on the maintenance staff or something. You know.
Like some of those titles, I think it was.
And strangely enough, that they discarded the footage of all these classic films, but the paperwork of this contest survives. Believe it or not, I actually rifled through the suggestion sheets handwritten by these Universal employees of the early 30s, writing these dopey titles down. Supposedly one of them was used for the British release. Don't tell.
Unholy Hour.
Unholy Hour.
Did you mention Bloom?
No, I didn't get to
That's
that.
probably
Well,
the
from
best one.
Tibet, Dr. Yugami of London, Werewolf Yugami, Beyond the Ken of Man. It's a little bit over the
I
top.
wonder if some of these are gags.
Kismet, The
Kismet.
Loose Wolf. That was one of the maintenance staff.
Yeah.
And best of all, as you say, Bloom, Flower, Bloom. And there was one, The Unholy Hour, I think we might have mentioned before, or
Yeah,
something that
that's
was
a-
really considered.
they used
But I
it,
couldn't
yeah.
believe when I was reading that. That's really funny. Getting on from into the next year, another one of my favorites that's not usually discussed and I think should be is the sequel to Dracula, Dracula's Daughter, a movie that was directed by somebody who was more associated with westerns.
We made a lot of westerns, and but he was sort of a contract director. We're talking about Lambert Hillier now, and he was directed to all sorts of assignments, and he just happened to snag a couple of horror films in with the mix, and he turned out to be a pretty good director. Although he wasn't used much after that. He made another film called The Invisible Ray, which was an early example of science fiction with a gothic touch, and Carla from Lugosi were in it.
But
But
pretty.
he did a very competent job.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But he always stayed a B director throughout his whole life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which says something about the entire creative team, I guess, as to what the final result is. Of course, that's another movie that went through a lot of changes before it reached the screen. Right, was
Directors like Lambert Hillier and Stuart Walker, they were, I don't want to call them traffic cop directors like we have nowadays, but they weren't like James Whale where they became intimately involved with the characters in the script and writing the script. And they would just hand it a script on a Friday, like Reginald Borg later on would say, another director, and they were shooting on Monday. They were involved in the writing and like Edgar Ulmer,
Right.
James Whale, even Robert Florey.
They were studio
They were
craftsmen,
studio, yeah.
and they got the film in on time.
Yeah, so that's why their films are less, illustrious than the ones made by the directors I just mentioned.
yeah. What was the average shooting schedule for something like Dracula's Daughter? What would
Probably
have
a
been?
couple weeks.
Yeah, probably 3 weeks, 4 weeks,
3
somewhere
weeks?
in there.
I don't
Yeah.
even think it was that long.
Yeah, I bet it's close.
When you
By
add-
the 40s, you're getting into 10-day schedules
Yeah,
and things
you're
like
right.
that.
There was,
Visual effects work took an extra few.
when they were
days.
6 you're talking about 6-day schedules in the 30s,
Yeah.
in the 40s too.
40s, yeah.
Yeah.
Like an Inner Sanctum title, for instance.
Some of your interviewees, like I think Peggy Moran, who starred in The Mummy's Hand and Horror Island, we're into the 40s now, talked about how hard it was,
But
right?
these are long days. When you say
Yeah.
6 days, we don't mean 9 to 5. She'd come in like at dawn and stay until midnight sometimes,
Yeah.
This was quite common
and work Saturdays.
on B pictures
Yeah.
because they had to be done within a schedule. Otherwise, there was no chance of these films making any money.
Yeah.
Unlike a movie like Gone with the Wind, the Maltese Falcon, the B films, you could not waste an extra penny on them, and they just had to make the schedule. If it involved working 12, 14 hours a day, so be it.
Yeah. Well, by the time we got to this era, I think 36 was about the last real good year, wasn't it, for the 30s cycle?
Yeah, oh yeah. The
And,
last, where they released 2 genre films that year.
But Universal changed hands.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was the new regime took over. They called the New Universal then.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they didn't want to make any horror films. They didn't for at least a year.
Yeah. So they started making some mysteries and things like Night
yeah.
Key.
Yeah.
Deanna
Call
Durbin
Off.
movies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there was a lot of public pressure to stop making horror movies. A lot of the civic
England
group,
got
a lot of the civic groups started breathing down the backs of the studios, saying that these films are unwholesome, they had a bad effect on children, and then the British market was suddenly lost on Hollywood because they banned horror films outright, which is another story in
Which
itself.
is a real big factor, right?
Yeah, and then you have these people like Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi who made nothing but horror films. Well, they had nowhere to go except, Karloff went on to be a character actor, and Lugosi's career just stopped in its tracks.
Well, Karloff had a more varied career even when he was making his horror films, whereas Lugosi just made one horror film after another with nothing to be. Very rarely did he make anything in between.
Lugosi wasn't all that versatile.
No.
If Lugosi had a different attitude back then and had played the game, so to speak, and learned the language, this is kind of a kind of a opinion.
Speculative.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you, Tom, for helping me with that. Would you see any closer relationship in their billing and their popularity? Do you think it would have been more of a real rivalry, or would Karloff still have eclipsed Lugosi? It's just an opinion. I don't know how you would even answer it, but
I think Karloff's versatility is what made him the star that he was, and Lugosi's lack of versatility just, put him in that one niche that he couldn't get out of.
Yeah, he was in such a rut that it's hard to picture him out of the rut to answer your question, to be honest with you.
well, you have answered it.
Imaginations aren't that great.
Even within a narrow scope of horror films, Karloff proved himself a more versatile actor, and he had a much greater standing with the rest of the other Hollywood studios.
He had more sympathetic characters.
He added a good deal more nuance to his characterizations.
Oh, sure.
Lugosi was considered Mr. Dracula, and fair or not, that tag just stuck, and it became the.
No, that's true. That's absolutely true. But something I don't think people realize is Karloff was just fractionally more lucky than Lugosi. When horror movies were out, Karloff only got just a very few more roles than Lugosi did. They were both completely out of luck whenever horror films were out of style. I mean, maybe during a lull, Lugosi would make 2 films and Karloff would make 4 or something like that in a 2 or 3 year period.
Well, Karloff spent time in England and he got roles there.
1 or 2, yeah.
Well, Karloff was snagged at least a Warner Brothers contract, the best contract that Lugosi could secure for himself with Poverty Row Studios. So that ought to tell you something right there.
Yeah, and that led to his 40s career, actually. That's where we're butted right up against the 40s. The last, in my opinion, really great Universal horror film of the 30s, and it really is more a product of the changing era into the 40s, is Son of Frankenstein, the final one of the trilogy of Karloff films. And then we're into the 40s. What do you think their best work was in the 40s, let's say?
Probably The Wolfman.
Well, I'm partial to Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein.
Yeah, you don't just consider that a comedy, I guess.
Well, I consider it a horror comedy, and by far the best movie they made in the 40s. In this category. Son of Dracula is also very good.
Yeah.
As soon as they got better directors, and usually by chance, the films became miraculously better. They had a very good director for just a B programmer type film called Son of Dracula, and the director put a lot of style in that. And I think the same would have held true for Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, because they had a very good director in Roy William Neill. Unfortunately, the script became something of a botch, and it became sort of a shapeless mess with Lugosi playing the monster, and there was a debacle, and they changed the script around, and they dropped scenes, and Lugosi had dialogue, and then they took the dialogue out. So
he was supposed to be blind, and then there was no references to that.
Really, that could have been a really good film.
But the first reels of that film, the graveyard scene, is almost probably the best thing Universal did in the
Until
40s.
Frankenstein comes on, it's awful darn good.
Yeah,
that's really true.
Wolfman's finest hour.
But if they nailed that script down, and this is something they should have found out before they even started the production, that could have been a pretty good film.
Yeah.
That is a pretty good film, but something I'm a little quite above.
The whole parts are better than the whole.
It's fun. I think everybody considers that a lot of fun.
But some of Universal's better horror films of the 40s might be Sherlock Holmes things like Pearl of Death and Scarlet Claw.
Roy William Neill again.
Yeah.
If you want to, they're under this Sherlock Holmes banner, so everybody considers them just mysteries, but they definitely have some real horrific and very well done too. And again, Roy William Neill, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, The Creeper and Pearl of Death, and the Canadian Marsh Monster and Scarlet Claw. Better than their straight horror stuff.
Well, they attempted a remake of The Phantom of the Opera with Claude Rains. Very expensive film, beautiful sets, beautiful color. And they turned it into a sort of a Hollywood extravaganza where the horror elements were so downplayed that they were practically non-existent.
Yeah.
So I guess the film made a lot of money, so it was very popular at the time, but it's not particularly well remembered. I kind of like it.
Before I forget, I want to, because I want to get back to the writing of the book and the people you contacted, but I want to touch on Lon Chaney Jr. And one of the questions that I had was, you see how good he could be in a film like The Wolfman, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, how natural he could be. And then they put him in this series of Inner Sanctum films, right? Mm-hmm. And it was as if he never took an acting lesson, at least in my opinion.
With the
What
exception
happened?
of Strange Confession, in which he's very good.
Yeah.
Because he
I
plays
confess I haven't seen in a while. So,
Oh, okay.
But
Strange confession.
He was always
confess I haven't seen Strange
in
Confession.
these films they cast him as professorial types. Well, he was like Mr. Everyday person in
Yeah.
films like Mermaid Monk. So even The Wolfman, he was just an average Joe. He was no intellectual giant. And in his roles, he plays a neurologist or a college professor or a mentalist or a lawyer. But in Strange Confession, that's the second from the last. He plays an average guy, and he's very good in it.
Yeah, you think it basically boils down to he was uncomfortable with these?
He was miscast.
Miscast, yeah.
Yeah.
I think the audiences were uncomfortable with Lon Chaney playing him like a mental giant.
Well, there were dozens of character actors in Hollywood of Chaney's type who had really fine careers, people like Wood Bond and people like Barton McLean. Unfortunately, Lon was stuck with this Chaney name, so he was the horror stamp pretty much stuck.
Yeah, they even dropped the junior, right?
Exactly. So he was miscast in a lot of his horror movies, which was sort of a shame, because when he went under the name Creighton Chaney, he couldn't get a job. As soon as he changed it to Lon Chaney Jr., his fate was more or less sealed, and I think he sort of made a bargain with the devil. He got a Universal contract and a fairly good living out of it, but it was he was stuck in a genre which he was not really suited or not really comfortable.
Now, we're talking about it, since we're on the Inner Sanctums, you guys met Reginald LeBorg and spent some time with him, didn't you? Reginald LeBorg directed of the two Inner Sanctum films he directed were Weird Woman and Calling Dr. Death.
Actually, three.
And Dead Man's Eyes.
Dead Man's Eyes?
Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that. And also he directed The Mummy's Ghost. It was his one, and Jungle Woman.
And
His two.
Destiny. Borderline.
Which one?
Destiny, he partially directed.
Well, what was that like? I mean, you actually got to screen some of his films with him and everything. And
Right.
what kind of a man was he?
Well, the funny thing about Reginald LeBorg was when I first wrote to him, I did very slightly less than 1/3 of the writing of this book, because it was my job to find these people and set everything up, and then we'd visit and do the interviews. And when I first wrote, I think you guys wrote to him and he said no to you, right flat out. Didn't you at some point in the distant past?
I think so.
Yeah, and then I wrote to him and he said that everybody who writes to him wants to hear about his horror movies, and can't we talk to him about everything else but? Well, that's exactly what we didn't want to do. So we kept after him and started buttering him up with cassettes, and I finally got to talk to him on the phone one day, and I just schmoozed my way in, and he finally relented, and turned out to be one of the nicest guys that we contacted in regard to this project. Had us into his house. We watched movies with him. This is something that none of the others joked with him and laughed at his artwork. We were very comfortable with him. He made us feel more at home than any of the other people did. Not that anybody else was less than nice.
All great.
They were all great, and he was greater. He was terrific, Reginald LeBorg.
Wasn't he sort of derisive about the films that he directed that you were watching?
Well, rightfully so.
To him, these were commerce films, and
It's very strange because he said his favorite film of all the films he directed was a picture called Destiny,
Oh, this is sad.
which he hadn't seen in 40 years. So we called him up, or Tom called him up with great jubilation, saying we tracked down a videotape of Destiny. So I went to his house in North Hollywood, and we put it on the VCR and watched it together, and after it was all over, it was no longer his favorite movie.
So this is your best, eh, Reggie?
Yeah, so
he died shortly after. A broken man. And the Tom's an expert.
I think San Diego, I Love You, sort of
All of a sudden, rolls up.
took a bump up the list.
Unfortunately, seeing these movies again for some of these people is a revelation. A guy named Howard Koch told me his favorite movie he made in the old days was Voodoo Island. And I sent him a tape, and he called me up, and he sounded very crestfallen. He says, "I'll have to rethink this."
I could have told him that before I looked at the tape.
Well, Tom, we were interviewing a Van engine over the 40s named Peggy Moran, and Tom mailed her a few tapes of films she had no idea she made.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Well, I guess back then they're doing this on such a quick schedule, and
Yeah.
they make these pictures with nothing memorable about them.
Yeah,
But
6 days out of their life, you know, I mean,
60 years ago.
60 years ago, who remembers?
yeah, but a picture like the mummy's hand, should you remember because it's something unique about it.
Well, not everybody sees a mummy walking around every day, even if it's an actor.
Yeah. And Virginia Christine, you had a nice experience with her.
Oh, very nice. She
Played the Princess Ananka in The Mummy's Curse.
Yeah, and she gave a first-rate performance.
Yeah.
She lifted that film out of the ordinary.
Yeah, she had us into her house also. She was married to Fritz Feld and served us milk and cookies, and just they talked about their careers for hours.
Yeah. And Tom, you took this interview thing and ran with it.
Yeah,
I did want to mention a couple of things that you've done, a lot of things you've done since then. Tom has a whole series of interview books out. I have a couple of them here. The non-McFarland books, because they have something on the cover. I don't know if I'm holding it in the right place and everything. This is Monsters, Mutants, and Heavenly Creatures, one of his later, what's this, a few books ago?
It's one of the newer ones, yeah.
Put out through Midnight Marquee Press. And this is the one with the William Allen interview in it.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting.
Most of my interview books are with people from the 50s and 60s, just only because the 30s and 40s people aren't around anymore to talk to.
Yeah. And Robert Clark, the
hideous sun demon
Sun
himself.
Demon himself, yeah, and who also appeared in some early Val Lewton movies in the 40s, Bedlam and The Body Snatcher, among many other interview books, too numerous to go into, really. But
Oh, do.
what?
Oh, do.
Do?
No.
Well, there's,
no, I've had a lot of fun doing this kind of stuff, but to be honest with you, the 30s people just aren't there to be talked to anymore, or they've been done already.
Well, considering the information that you've mined from all these different people, not just actors and actresses or directors, but sound men and I think his
Anybody
name
who
is
could tell us anything, yeah.
And the hunt still goes on. Right?
It does, but for newer and newer movies, unfortunately, the door is starting to close on these old things.
Hello, this is Ted Boas, director of such wonderful films as Vampire Victims from Venus. Makes a good blank. You're watching Front Row. Enjoy it. I did.
You know, as much of a fan as I am of the Universal films, I learned a lot from Universal Horrors. Now, if we've interested you enough to want your very own copy of the book, you can get it by contacting McFarland and Company Publishers. Well, that's it for now. I'll be looking for you next time in the front row.
Yeah.
Rightfully so.